Shalom.
Boker Tov.
Boker or. Everybody doing well?
Yes.
So it's morning. Good morning. Good morning again, Adam.
Here we go. 2 more minutes of morning. Yep.
Sandy, good morning. And Cantor, everybody.
Morning, Boker Tov. Change. Let's see. All right. Well, hard to believe we're almost halfway through this class already. Takes a year to, yeah.
Did you happen to record the last 2 classes? I was out of town and missed them.
Yes, they should be on YouTube.
Okay.
Yep. The Thursday class is always recorded and then put up on YouTube.
Okay, great.
Again, I know I've watched myself a few times and come away and said, okay, I need to work on that. So
Don't change anything.
don't change anything. There you go. I appreciate that. That's lovely.
Mhm.
And there's Lou. Where are you today, Lou? Where do you find yourself?
I'm at the Houston Jewish Funerals office today.
All right.
I'll be on mute so that I don't bother everybody else in the office who's sitting right behind me, wondering what's he talking to? Who's he talking to?
Who's he
So I have
talking
my
to?
headphones on. So
Okay. Well, I guess it's kind of, we don't want to wake the dead. Is that bad joke?
it can't be woken.
Depends on how you believe in resurrection.
That's it. There you go. I do believe my class will not be the source of resurrection.
I am not waiting for it to happen.
All right. I got 12:01. I'm going to get started. Hopefully some more people can join us if they choose to, but we're going to get started. Today's topic is the Talmud. All right, just off the top, just a sense that there are a number of words that get mixed and matched. Like we talk about Torah, and Torah can mean the document, the scroll, but Torah can mean everything, that all Jewish learning. When we talk about the Talmud, we generally are referring to what is also known as the Gemara. All right, but Talmud can also mean Talmud, Mishnah, and Gemara together. And so there's many ways in which we're talking about. Here, what we're talking about is Talmud in the sense of Gemara. That's today. We really dealt with Mishnah last time. So convinced that Jewish life could recover from the defeats that they had experienced with Rome only through dedication to Torah, the rabbis organized themselves in a way that they could spread their teaching, they could gain disciples, and they could assume the largest possible role in Jewish life. Of all of the books that the rabbis left behind, the most revealing, the most challenging, the most rewarding is probably the Talmud. There are 2 Talmuds. I'm going to assume no knowledge and go from there. And please let me know if I'm making it either too basic or something I've skipped. All right, the 2 Talmuds. You have the Palestinian Talmud, known as the Yerushalmi. You have the Babylonian Talmud. Both of those emerge after centuries of debate, study, and clarification. If you were to look at the Talmud in its structure, the first thing you'd notice is that there's a lot, it's not a single person studying. Rarely do you have one person involved in leading the process. You always have a senior scholar with either a junior scholar or a class, in a sense, junior scholars, and those hopefully ultimately become colleagues. In Babylonia, the senior colleague usually possessed what they called reshut, permission, the authority to adjudicate legal cases. And that, in a sense, in Babylonia was the equivalent of what was happening in Palestine, what they would call as smicha, the placing of hands on somebody, the ordination. They had legal authority, the senior partner. So indeed, these rabbis who are in the senior partners are teachers and judges, and they give guidance on practices about everything in Jewish life. Two more terms. The rabbis of the Mishnah were known as the Tanaim. The rabbis of the Gemara, of the later Talmuds, were known as the Amoraim. Okay, so those are two separate terms. If you don't remember, ask, and I'll remind you as we go along, please. All right.
Cantor,
There were-
could I
yeah.
just ask, I'm so sorry, because
Go ahead.
I missed last time. What unit are we in? 'Cause
7.
we're in unit 7, okay.
Wait, let me just make sure that's right. Hold on one second. Let me just make sure.
6.
It's actually 6. I take that back. It's 6. It's unit 6.
Also, could you remind us of the time periods for the Mishnah and for the Gemara?
Yes. So the Mishnah really begins, it's hard to announce when something begins, but somewhere in the 1st century before the Common Era, and it's redacted and compiled and theoretically finished sometime between 200 and 225 of the Common Era. The Talmud, by definition, is picking up on that because it's exploring the Mishnah. And so the Babylonian Talmud will continue until about the 5th century. The Babylonian Talmud continues until about the 7th century. As you'll see, those 200 extra years make a big difference. All right, does that we have a time frame?
Thanks.
Okay.
All right, and so could you now repeat the 2 words you just gave us before?
All right. Tanaim are the rabbis of Mishnaic times. Amoraim are the rabbis of Talmudic times, of Gemara times, post 225. I could simplify it and just say the rabbis, but probably you should know these terms over time. So, all right. So what would happen is there were circles of teachers and students that would get together, kind of like what we're doing here. Think of it in that manner, okay? They'd get together, and for convenience, we're calling it a school, all right? But it's really not a school in a full sense, traditionally. The school, they would often meet perhaps daily, and there was an inner hierarchy that existed within these programs. And so when the master, the teacher of the group of rabbis, of potential rabbis, would die, the schools often dissolved and the students would go to other masters, unless somebody in the class was ready to take on, had achieved a status of such learning that they could take on the group. Right? But it's not in the formal sense. There weren't really academic institutions. It's hard to tell early in the Amoraic time. In Palestine, again, we have 2 different communities here. The Patriarchal Academy was used, most of the learning happened in Sepphoris and Tiberias. That's where the great majority of activity is happening in Israel. Right? In Babylonia, the formal learning really took place much later. It's only in Gaonic times, which is probably 800 that there were central institutions that develop in Babylonia. So it's more centralized in Palestine early. It becomes later, it's more centralized in Babylonia. So the first thing is, what is it they're studying? They're studying the Mishnah. Their goal is to expand upon the Mishnah. And so what you had was a Tana, somebody who would read the text out loud. Remember, this is still not oral. It's not written. They're studying it in an oral way. And then discussions and analysis of the text ensued. They'd engage in comparison and contrast of different texts. But what you have is a very freewheeling nature of the discussion. And that's important for a number of reasons. First of all, if someone were to sit down and just finalize the discussion, you wouldn't deliberately have the sort of chaos that exists. And that sort of lends credibility to the fact that these actually were the discussions. Right? In a sense, its haphazard nature implies that, yeah, we have what they were talking about, as opposed to an editor who took the whole thing and made sense out of it. Okay. The Mishnah, as I mentioned to you as well, was often devoid of biblical proof text. They assumed that you knew the biblical text that you were talking about. All right, they separated the text in a certain way from its biblical origins. The Amoraim, the Talmudic rabbis, seek to reintegrate the law and the biblical text, and they search for the biblical citations that were related to the discussion. So they then go back into the Bible and say, Leviticus 32, here is what they're talking about. Diane, does that make sense? Okay, I'm just kind of watching faces to see if I've lost anybody, because it's a little hard to know sometimes. Okay. This process continued over centuries. And so what you've got is a layering. You've got a layering of Sandy Weiner said this, and here's this wisdom. A generation later, here's what one of Sandy's kids said, built on what Sandy said. And it continues on for generations and generations. You've got a building of information. So sometimes it's not as organized as you'd like it to be as a result. You've ever seen a Talmudic page, you've got the Mishnah in the middle and lots of different commentaries all around the side, but they're often built. You'll see as an example in later texts, Nachmanides commenting on what Rashi said. They're building one upon the other, all right, building one upon the other. They also digress. It's a teacher's worst nightmare. I taught a class last night in Kehila High, in the community high school, and there was one kid who was absolutely intent on making sure I didn't get to talk about what I wanted to talk about. All right. I had to stop them and say, no more what ifs, or we're going to get far astray. But the Talmud didn't do that. Not only did they not limit their going astray, their tangents, they would devote as much time to the tangent as to the original issue. And so what you've got is this working, you start with question A, and by the time you've got this section of the Talmud, there's 900 additional questions that have come up, each of which have been treated with the same seriousness as the original comment. Sometimes it's hard to follow. All right. In Babylonia, remember I told you there were about an additional 200 years for the Babylonian Talmud after the Palestinian Talmud. Basically in Palestine, what happened is the community disintegrated. And so the Talmud was just left as it was. The Babylonian Talmud continued on for another 200 years. But what's interesting to note is that in those 200 years, the rabbis are not cited by name. Somehow, all of the rabbis of that extra 200 years remain anonymous. All right. David Weiss Halivni has called them the Stamayim. Stam just means, of course, that's who it is. In a sense, you say Stam, that's it. That's what it is. So these are rabbis, we don't know who, but what they did and what makes the Babylonian Talmud, in a sense, more effective for us is they began to put things in patterns and orders. The Palestinian Talmud is sort of all over the place. Those extra 200 years were years in which they took all of this writing and tried to create categories and make sense of it. And as a result, the Babylonian Talmud has taken on greater importance for us and become the dominant document. So I now want to take a few minutes on the Palestinian Talmud and a few minutes on the Babylonian Talmud. So the first thing is, I'm deliberately calling it the Palestinian Talmud, not the Yerushalmi. What does Yerushalmi imply? Jerusalem. Well, that's what it's usually called in Hebrew. The problem with that is that for most of this period, under both Roman and Byzantium rule, Jews were prohibited from living in the holy city. So to refer to it as the Jerusalem Talmud is by definition a misnomer. It was an Israeli text. It was the Palestinian, in terms of Palestine. And so I've been referring to it as the Palestinian Talmud for that reason. In form, it is structured on the Mishnah. So if Mishnah section number 1 says this, the Talmud's first section will talk about what the Mishnah said in Talmud section number 1. The Mishnah begins with the laws of when you can say Shema. And so the beginning of the Talmud comments on the Mishnah's comments on when you can say Shema. It's sequenced in the same way the Mishnah is. However, there are only, of the 63 tractates of the Mishnah, only 39 made them into the Palestinian Talmud. They didn't get finished, essentially. All right. And the Palestinian Talmud is only basically about half the size of the Babylonian Talmud. What is included in the Babylonian Talmud is also different from what you'll find included in the Babylonian. Reason being, the laws of the agricultural laws that exist in the Mishnah don't apply outside the state of Israel, the land of Israel. So the Palestinian Talmud spends a lot of time on the agricultural ways, the sacrificial systems, because it's still relevant in Palestine. You won't find those discussions in the Babylonian Talmud because it didn't. It's like writing here in America. We don't concern ourselves with in the same way with the laws that only apply to the land of Israel. We just wouldn't. And just an interesting note is, although the Babylonian Talmud is obviously dominant, as I keep saying, there's been a recent surge in interest in studying the Palestinian Talmud. One of the people that was kind of led that revolution is somebody many of you know, and that was Judy Abrams. Okay. So that's the Palestinian. I'm summarizing it very, very briefly. The Babylonian Talmud. This is being written in Babylonia. Couple facts about this text. Number one, just like the Mishnah, every tractate begins on page 2. There is no page 1. The message being there's no beginning. Okay, you just jump in. Wherever you start in this process, you're going to feel like you're joining a conversation already in progress. So for those of you, you arrived a few minutes late for the class, you're joining the conversation in progress. That's what was meant by starting with page 2. That was the intent. Okay. I'm not calling you out because I'm glad you're here. I'm not calling you out for being late. I'm just glad you're here. Okay. But your best bet really is to start at the beginning. Why? Because it assumes as you go along that principles that were established, principles of ways of addressing the text, of concepts that come up because of the conversations, as you go along, it assumes you know the previous ideologies and assumptions that were laid out for you. So ideally, you're starting at the beginning. All right. It's not just like the Palestinian Talmud. It's not complete for the Mishnah. There are sections that are left out. And so, for example, I just said to you, the first order is called Zera'im, seeds. And the only section that the Babylonian Talmud addresses in that entire order is brachot. Mishnah is about the brachot. They skip all of the agricultural stuff. There's no need. You have the order, the Seder of Taharot, of purity. You only find the laws of Nidah, of being a mikvah, basically, and those kinds of things in the Mishnah, because the rest of it didn't apply. You weren't making yourself pure to enter the temple. And so it didn't apply. What you've got here, much like the Mishnah, it's turned into, in its early stages, a curriculum of applicable study. Right? We're not going to study that which we don't live. And so the Talmuds become laws that are being studied by the most scholarly people. It is not necessarily interested in determining law, although that happens. It's understood that study and explanation were never complete. And so what it's doing, its intent is to begin conversations that over the generations continue to grow. It is a curriculum. I've said this to you on a number of occasions. It is meant to be a curriculum for what you need to know. For the historian, this book, this Talmud, is a terribly frustrating book. It is rich with stories which may or may not reflect the way things happened. It's full of legal discussions, which may or may not represent the actual content of early rabbinic study. All right. They did summarize. They did, in certain ways, create. This was not meant to be a document of history. They had no intent of creating a historical record. And so if you're a historian trying to make sense of this, the challenge is pretty difficult. All right. Any comments on either of the two Talmuds? Okay. I'm going to go on to some things that sort of come out of it. One is midrashim, and the other is liturgy, prayer. Let's start with the midrashim. There is no single book of midrashim. The Torah is a book. You want to talk about the prophets, it's all clear. Despite the popular use of the term, you really cannot say with accuracy the Midrash says. Because Midrash is a type of literature and there are various collections of it and they contradict one another. There's no attempt to try and have them all consistent. And so when you say the Midrash says, you really are not being fair. You have to say a Midrash says, because there could be another Midrash that says completely the opposite. There are two types of Midrashic materials. The first is halakha, Jewish law. It's primarily, this part of Midrash is basically concerned with law and codes of behavior. And by the way, when you have this, it's talking about civil and religious law, because for the Jew, there is no distinction. All civil law is religious law. Okay, all comes from understanding what we think God wants. So there's no distinction. So that's halakha. Halakha, by the way, is a term we use for Jewish law. It means the going, the way. All right, that's its intent. The other part, one is halakha, the other is agadah. And this is incredibly loose, wide-ranging. It refers to narrative literature, parables, theological statements, ethical statements, homilies, lectures, sermons. In Jewish law, as we approach if I'm in a contrast here, Jewish law always suggests that the earlier the scholar, the more important it is. So if Moses says something, it has greater effect than Akiva, because he came earlier. If Akiva says something and someone says something 300 years later, the earlier is more connected to Sinai, and there's an assumption that the earlier scholars knew more. That's not true of Agadah, of all these kinds of homilies. It's all over the place. There's no assumption that earlier texts carried more weight than later texts. They also, the Agadot, were intended for the masses. I kept talking to you about a lot of the Talmud being really for the scholarship. It's for the rabbis who would spend their time studying. The Agadah was intended for the masses. And as a result, a lot of it was imparted during sermons. So 2 weeks ago, I gave you a perspective on Noah, that he failed, that he got so busy, so involved in building an ark, because that's what God said to him, that he didn't question God. Two, he did nothing about changing the behaviors of his generation. And the result is, while he built an ark, civilization was destroyed. That's one perspective. I know there's other midrashim out there that I could have, and maybe in a subsequent year I will, that'll say Noach was a tzaddik. He was the best. Okay? That's what Agadah is. It's taking a particular lens on a text because again, we don't know how good a person Noach was. We know very little about what he was thinking. Okay, the biblical style is stark and laconic. There's not much there. We have facts. We don't know what the motivations of the characters. We don't know the feelings of the characters. We don't know the thoughts of the characters. And so Midrash comes along and starts to fill in gaps that the Torah is not providing. So for example, if I were to say to you, why did Cain kill Abel? So what the rabbis did is they looked at what happened before and then tried to come up with a reason for it. Okay, well, just before that, it talks about Cain's sacrifice not being accepted, and Abel's was, and Cain was jealous, but the Torah doesn't say that. Or why, we all know, what did Abraham's father do for a living? He was an idol maker. Show me that in the Torah. We don't really know. And so what the Midrash is doing is filling in gaps so that we can teach lessons from the text. Those are called sermons in today's world. Why didn't Moses speak with a speech impediment? Well, he touched the coal, and he took the hot coal, and he touched his lips from that, and therefore he spoke with an impediment. Yeah, again, I suggest to you, show me which verse in the Torah suggests that. So filling in. So Midrash, first of all, any thoughts on that? Lou?
I don't think Vicky included me.
Why does
Yeah.
Midrash then carry so much weight?
Did you?
Okay, so it carries weight because when the rabbi sat down and wrote this, what did they imply about the Talmud? That it was all given at Sinai. These are conversations that God ultimately predicted would happen and was transmitted orally, and therefore, on some level, even the Midrashim carry the weight of divine inspiration, even when they contradict one another. Sandy. Okay, I'm just looking at who unmuted. Stanley, go ahead.
Okay. You know, when you're studying Torah, Talmud, the Steinsaltz, because you're reading in English, has
Right.
spilled in much data that isn't in the Hebrew.
Right.
And so that's basically what you're saying. He's done basically what was done before.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the case. First of all, the minute you translate, you're already droshing.
Right.
All right. And then he's taken it a step further, as you're saying, and done some explaining, trying to make the text available to larger audiences. He's added explanations and interpretations to make it available to the masses. That's correct. Okay. So Midrash, I'm talking about this Agadah, also functions in the halachic realm. So for example, what does the Bible, we know the Bible says, observe the Shabbat, vishamru et ha-Shabbat, lasot et ha-Shabbat, to do the Shabbat. How do you do Shabbat? Bible doesn't tell us. All right. And so the Talmud steps in. You realize that even in establishing the laws, that is a midrashic process. They're sitting down and interpreting and making sense. I use the example over and over. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. That's all the Bible says to us. And somehow the rabbis droshed that into, you can't have a cheeseburger. So this process of midrash affect not only sort of the stories and the parables, it affects the legal way in which we live. How does one love a neighbor as oneself? Bible says that. What does it mean? What's the practical application of that? We have the Italian law and an eye for an eye. How does that play out? Bible doesn't tell us. They have to interpret. And that's what's going on in this text. It's midrash, either in legal form or in tale form. T-A-L-E, not T-A-I-L. Okay. So the question arises, how could the rabbis have allowed themselves the freedom and the flexibility to offer these new interpretations of Torah, in a sense, at times to even change the laws of the Bible of itself? How could they have had the chutzpah to have done this? The first is, I'm going to offer a couple answers. One is, we really can't say if they believed that that's what they were doing, in any way changing anything. Two, we actually, they seemed, as we quote in Pirkei Avot, Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men. They believed that this was the process, that it really was coming from God. And the assumption that they're working with is that all new interpretations were actually internally implied by the Torah itself. And what the rabbis were doing was uncovering an implication that lied there underneath. God, the perfect author, created a book or a text and could foresee that new interpretations would need to be found through proper study. And what the rabbis are doing is fulfilling what God is expecting of them, to go into the text and find those hidden messages. In the words of a midrashic text about the Bible, turn it over and turn it again, for everything is included in the biblical text. So their perspective is they're not changing anything. Study, the point of study is to pull out what's underlying and there all along. Comments? Okay. Whereas the midrash of the midrashim of the Tanaitic times, the Mishnah times, was really a product of the schoolhouse. It really was just for scholars. By the time we get to the later Talmudic times, as I said to you, it was being presented to the masses through homilies, through sermons, in synagogues, which were rapidly emerging at this time as the central institution of life. With the emergence of the synagogue, the sermons came with it. And so it was a way of distributing the knowledge to the larger population. With that started to grow a prayer collection. We know that before, it's likely that people came, they brought their sacrifices and they said personal prayers. We know that in temple times, there were Levitical choirs that chanted the Psalms. Nonetheless, there doesn't seem to be any fixed communal ritual that you would describe as an organized worship service. And as a result, when the temple is destroyed, there were prayers that were sort of being said. And so the result was that there was already a seed to build prayer as the substitution for the sacrificial system. And what they did is they began, and I'm going to focus on the Amidah bit here, but they began by listing out what the blessings of the Amidah would be. Now, mind you, it's just the blessing. So if you look at the weekday Amidah, and you take the first blessing after Kedusha, the blessing is Baruch Atah Chonein Hadad, who grants knowledge. But there's a whole paragraph that comes before that. That's not what the rabbis were concerned with. They were only concerned with the bracha itself. And they would list out the brachot, and the different people would get up and chant, and whoever led would come up with something relative to that blessing and say a few words about it, and then say the blessing. It was personalized until about the 700s, 800s. The blessing was fixed. The text around it was personalized. Just make sure I get this right. So, and I'm going to take you into some of the text of the Amidah in a few minutes. All right. So hold on to that. Going forward, by the time the Talmud is composed, what you have to realize is the rabbis were not the only group of people out there trying for leadership. They were one of the movements of Jewish life. Their influence was growing steadily, but the Jewish community was not necessarily organized around them. If they wanted influence, they were going to have to do that through their teachings. They were motivated to give sermons. They were motivated to have places where they were teaching because they were gaining disciples in process. What we do know, though, is by the Middle Ages, rabbinic teaching had become the basis of all Jewish religious life. Somehow in that 1,000 years, things had changed. Talmudic literature now became the property of everyone, not because everybody studied it, but because everybody accepted its authority. Think of the Constitution. Most of us don't sit down and study the Constitution all day long, but we do accept its authority as binding. And so by the Middle Ages, that's the role Talmud was playing. It had become more than just a study guide, which it was in its early stages. It now became the law of the community. Following that, so now you're in the Middle Ages, the Talmud is fixed, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but I'll come back next week, I promise. Once it's fixed, in the Middle Ages, they had to come up with a new method of addressing issues. And I'll give you a couple that came about. One is the responsum. As you can imagine, somebody's asking questions and they're looking for a response, an answer, shuvot. All right. Medieval Jewry never really developed any kind of hierarchy in terms of, among the rabbis' world, but nonetheless, every generation knew who the great scholars were. Okay, they knew, in a world of rabbis, it's an example, everybody sort of recognized, Vilna Gaon was special. All right. And so what would happen is the rabbis around the world would address questions to these luminaries. And again, an example would be, I know when Rabbi Teller has a question, he would often turn to his Rabbi Brad Artson, with the dean of his school. He would turn to somebody because Rabbi Teller has a congregation to deal with. Not all of his time can be devoted to study. But you've got a rabbi who's running a rabbinical school, and what's his job? Study. And so you turn to the luminaries of your generation for further information, and that's what they did. Each responsum, when you would be preceded by a question. Now, I love this fact. It's very good to be the guy answering, because what you get is not only a question, but it's the responsibility of the person asking the question to present all of the relevant texts that might apply here, all right, and possible even interpretations. So if Sandy, I want to know something about a response on law, it's my job to essentially be the to look up everything, to give you all the materials to work from, and then to say to you, okay, which is right? All right, wonderful process. So that's one, responsum. The second one has had a major impact on our lives, and that's what became known as the Code of Laws. As with the Bible, if you want to know what the Talmud says about Shabbat, you better be prepared to read all of the Talmud, because it's all over the place. You'd have to search all through. In today's world, we have a computer, and it's very nice. I can punch in Talmud, and I can punch in Shabbat, and it'll tell me where to look in the Talmud. All right? But you had to literally search through. As a result, soon commentaries began to arise, and the great codes, and the greatest of those was in the medieval times was Maimonides' code of law. All right, the Mishnah Torah. Now, Maimonides also was a philosopher. So if you look at it, it begins with this whole philosophical introduction, and it ends with the laws that are involved. Okay, so the whole philosophy that underlies it as well. That's not Talmudic. In between is he's worked out everything in the sequence that he can. He says, he wrote that the purpose of his code was to make study of Talmud unnecessary for those who simply just wanted to know the law. And for so doing, he was almost excommunicated. There were plenty of discussions about whether he should be. That wasn't the last text. The one that most influential text in modern life is what we call the Shulchan Aruch. Joseph Caro, and he lived in 1488 to 1575. He basically ignored all laws that were no longer applicable. Okay, he only dealt with that which really applied in the world. It became the dominant. In today's world, most of us have on our shelves. This is what's known as the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. It's the abbreviated version of the Shulchan Aruch. If I want to know what the Orthodox are going to say, that's where I turn. Okay, I know it's going to give me all of my answers. If you look later, in the conservative movement, Isaac Klein put out Guide to Jewish Religious Practice. Oftentimes within conservative Judaism, when we want to know what the law says, turn to Isaac Klein. Not the only answer, he's one. He represents a much more traditional lens than most of us in the conservative movement live by. But if you want to know what the traditional response is, that's where I turn. These are codes, meaning they enable us to pull out from the Talmud, what do I do? Don't give me all the discussion, what do I do? So in today's world, one of the reasons people study Talmud is not for practical purposes. It isn't necessarily to pull out information. What has become is study for study's sake. You study Talmud because it's a way of bringing one closer to God. You're taking generations and generations of people who struggled with the idea of what God wants of us, and you're joining, therefore, a conversation with God and all those who struggled with God over the centuries. So the mere concept of studying Talmud is in and of itself a sacred ritual. It is a holy ritual, and it has become, in the opinion of many, the most important mitzvah of all. You've heard the expression Talmud Torah keneged kulam. The study of Torah is equal to all of the other laws of the Torah. Now, that, of course, is written by rabbis who had a motivation to say that. Okay. All right. But the study of Torah in today's world, if you go to yeshivas, they're not sitting and studying to figure out what do I do. They're engaging in a holy conversation, of which sometimes they learn what to do. But that's not the point. Thoughts? Stanley, go ahead.
Couple of things.
Go ahead.
I find a lot, there's so much there, even a daf of the day that bothers you about today. I mean, because of today's, how we live. And particularly.
Can you give us an example? Yeah.
Well, I mean, you could be talking about the what happens with a woman for getting married and talking about the ketubah, just that alone is, what you do and what happens to the woman before and after and during the thing. I mean, all these things, and there's never really, and what comes out of it too, the rabbis don't always, there's always never the correct answer.
Right.
But it doesn't really, all of that doesn't really apply anymore.
That's correct.
And so it really is difficult to I don't know, to just, count this. It's one thing like when you talk about prayers, the prayers are the things like how the morning prayers go, or are they, how the prayers go every day. And
Right. And I'm going
and
to
they
introduce,
are
I'm going to introduce some
applicable.
of the codes about the Amidah in a few minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, so when you do, you're going to tell all that, and that's sort of how it is. It's practical, but a lot of these others, it has no bearing on what the world is today. That's just my opinion.
Right,
I
so-
like to read it, and I like to study it,
Why?
but then,
So I'm going to push you on that. So why? And I'm not really
Why?
asking you why in the sense of you shouldn't be doing that. Of course, I'm happy to hear that, but why?
because occasionally you get a little pearl out of maybe one, it feels like it's something that applies to you,
Okay.
that you could get something out of it.
So
But
the
that's
purpose is to find
the main reason. It's the same reason you go to, you pray in the morning. It's there's sometimes it applies to something that really affects you for that day, maybe, or what's going on, or anything else.
So for
And that's
you,
why.
the purpose is pragmatic.
Yes.
Okay. I can't tell you that's right or wrong, but I'm defining it. Okay, Lou, go ahead.
If I can share a short story. So when I came to town 20 years ago, I was trying to do some Sunday morning study until somebody interrupted me and told me that the toilet was overflowing. So
That's synagogue life at its best.
Yeah. So Rabbi Strauss was teaching a course on Talmud, and I'm sitting in class, and it happened to be the beginning of brachot, when to say the Shema. And of course, you got, as you said, you get off on tangent and tangent and tangent. And there's a story in there that says you should not hold a piece of raw meat in your hand and cut it at the table. This was on Sunday morning. Tuesday night, I happened to go home 2 days later at about 8 o'clock. I walked in the door and my wife said, "I did something stupid today." And I said, "What'd you do? Burn yourself?" Because that's usually what she did. She said, "No, I was holding a piece of meat and I cut it and the knife slipped and I cut my thumb." So there is practicality
There you go.
in these
See,
plays.
as Leslie Wynn would say, it was Besheret. Right, exactly. All right, I want to just expose you to a little bit of the codes. And this is, on one hand, I'm exposing you to codes. On the other hand, I'm picking a topic that actually has practical application, and that's the Amidah. Okay, so how many of you have the text? If you did, if not, I'm going to read it. Okay, so I'm taking this text, and this is from the Shulchan Aruch. That's where we're going. So when you say in the beginning of the Amidah, there's 6 words at the top before the first bracha, Tehilot Le'el Elyon, all right, that start out with praising of God. And this text says, when on saying those words before the Amidah, we must rise and prepare ourselves for the prayer of the Amidah. We must remove the phlegm and saliva or anything else that tends to distract our thoughts. We then take 3 steps backwards and say the 6 words Tehilot Le'el Elyon, and then we go, and then we take 3 steps forward, and as it says, in the manner of one approaching a king. Very pragmatic. How do you start out? 3 steps back, 3 steps forward. You make sure that you don't have anything that could potentially distract you. If nature is calling, go take care of it beforehand. Okay. And you take 3 steps back, 3 steps forward in the manner of somebody approaching a king. That's number 1. 2, the worshiper should be aware that when you say the Amidah, the divine presence stands before you. You are to speak in a way, let the person think as if he were speaking to a mortal king. He would prepare his speech and take care not to blunder. It's sort of what I say to the kids when we have a service, and I say to them, I really want you to dress up. If you were going to go to the White House, how would you dress? So how are you going to go to the boss of the White House, God, okay? How would you dress to go before God? How would you speak? You'd be prepared. You'd go through a series of preparatory actions. You're going to know what you're saying. All right. The word, that's 2. 3, the worshiper should know, the person leading should know the meaning of the words that he utters with his lips. I have a hard time sometimes with asking congregants to lead if they don't know what they're saying. How can I say amen to somebody's blessing if they don't even know what the blessing said? Okay. You're supposed to spend time preparing, looking at it, not turning the page and, oh yeah, that's what's next. I can tell you with the Moxer, I can picture it in my head as I'm reading one page, what's coming up on the next. I know where I'm going. I have direction. I have in process. One should stand, it says, one should place his feet together as if they are one, simulating the angels of whom it is written in Ezekiel, and their feet were straight feet. That is, that the feet appear as if they are 1 foot. So technically, when you say the Amidah, you do not move. Your feet are together, and as a result, people should know if you're standing on the end of the aisle and somebody comes and they want to get in, you don't move. Your attention is on God, not the person trying to get into the aisle. That's why when I used to sit in the congregation, I would literally step out of my seat and stand next to the pew so that both aisles people could get in. I wouldn't be asked to move. All right, feet together, not moving. You should drop your head slightly. Close your eyes so as not to look at anything. You see me do that, okay? If you're reading from a Siddur, do not take your eyes off of the book. I go out of my way when I lead services, when I'm doing the Amidah, not to make eye contact with congregants. There's nothing more distracting than a human face. And they show this with babies, given pictures of anything they could look at. Give them a range, they will always turn to a circle where the face is drawn. They will always turn to a face. There is nothing more distracting. And so if I want to focus on God, and I'm not entertaining, I can't emphasize that enough. When you pray, it is not about entertaining the congregation. It is about addressing God, and hopefully people are going with you in that process. Okay, what else here? It says, one should be careful to pray the Shemona when you're doing it silently, quietly. So you have to move your lips. So you have to go, you're supposed to move your lips. You should be able to hear something, but the person next to you should be able to hear nothing. All right, there's a full engagement that's expected. You're not allowed to pray in front of a picture. All right, or unless in some way, if you can close your eyes if you have to. But you can never, ever pray in front of something that is reflective, like a mirror. So I go to Shiva homes, and I notice I'm standing there and I'm leading the congregation. On the wall in front of me is a picture in which I'm seeing my reflection. You're not even allowed to close your eyes in that moment. You got to move. I make a point of not standing in front of a picture because the likelihood is what I'm looking at is myself. What else I got for you? Okay. So here's another one. When praying the Shemona Esrei, you might need to stand facing the land of Israel. This is a ridiculous concept because it's a round planet. All right. And the reality of it is, no matter where you're looking, the synagogue in Dallas made that Elliot Gershenson and I have had this joint feeling that the synagogue made the worst decision in its history when they had the opportunity to buy this building that was a Baptist church that sat 4,000 people in the sanctuary, that had 200 classrooms, and they were selling it at 20 cents on the dollar because they just wanted out. And the leadership said no, because the sanctuary wasn't facing east. And the rabbi stood up and said to them, that's not law. Not only is it not law, there's a section in the Talmud that says you shouldn't face east, you should face southeast. Why? Because when you face east, you give the impression of worshiping the rising sun. So the synagogue made this decision to take a building worth $40 million and not buy it for 10 when their own building was worth 14 or 15. It was simply a trade, all based on a flawed concept. Luke, go ahead. Oh, I thought you had, okay. When you finish the Amidah, you take 3 steps back, right? So you're leaving God's presence in a sense. You're symbolically doing that. But you do so, I love this, you start with your left foot. This is detail, okay? Why do you start with your left foot? Because most people being right-handed tend to start with their right foot, and you want to convey that you're not happy about leaving God's presence. All right? None of this is biblical. This is codes. This is not even Talmudic. This is codes. This is the way the rabbis over time came to create a prayer service. All that exists in the Talmud are the list of the blessings of the Amidah, not even the rest of the text. Never mind, how do you do it? That's what the codes are. And those codes are only about 400 or 500 years old. The ones we're using it's not from Sinai, it's 400 or 500 years old. All right, any last questions, comments, or thoughts about the Amidah in general? And not to mention the codes of Talmud or whatever else we talked about.
Could you just repeat what you just said is only in the Talmud?
So all you have in the Talmud, when you talk about the Amidah, is the list of here are the 18 Baruch Atahs, the blessing. The surrounding text that you find in the Amidah, the blessing is Baruch Atah Hashem Noten Chonen Da'at. But before that, you'll find Atah Chonen Le'adam Da'at U'Melamed La'Noshbi. Now, there's this whole paragraph that precedes it. And then you say the blessing, the summary breath. None of that preceding text is in the Talmud. All you have is the blessing. Okay, anybody else? Okay, wow, good. I hope this was helpful in some way. You've got a sense of what's in the Talmud. You've got a sense of what developed from it over time. And you've got a sense of the practical nature of what happened because the Talmud doesn't give you that. And so you have, in a sense, someone did a search online, pulled out all the relevant information and created a new document. That's what the codes are. All right. Have a wonderful week. We'll play again next week. I thank you all for being here. I hope I didn't bore the heck out of you. Okay.
Thank you.
A good week.